Well, the polls are now open as New York City voters decide the future of their city, making their picks in the mayoral primary. Because the city leans blue, all eyes will be on the Democratic race, which features more than a dozen candidates. They are all vying to replace Bill de Blasio, whose 2 terms as mayor are coming to an end. So, for more on this race, I want to bring in John Diaz. He is a CBSN New York reporter, and there he is joining us now. John, so where do things stand in this race right now? Has there been any sort of last-minute shuffling in the polls?
Not really too much last-minute shuffling, no. Of course, there are a lot of different polls, but one of the latest ones from the Ipsos mayoral poll has Eric Adams. He's at 28%. He has been the front runner really this entire time of this mayoral race. He has major name recognition here in New York City. He is the borough president here of Brooklyn, so a lot of people know him. A lot of people watch out for him. A lot of people have learned from him over his term here in Brooklyn. So Eric Adams, he's at 28% right now. Then you have Andrew Yang, of course. He also has major name recognition really across the entire country, but a lot of people, here in New York, not too familiar with him exactly, just nationally is that name recognition, but he's at 20%. Then you have Catherine Garcia, she's at 15%. Maya Wiley at 13%. Scott Stringer, who is at 8%. He also has plenty of name recognition. He is New York City comptroller, but again, Eric Adams, the top contender right now, and of course, undecided. 6% of people are still undecided. There's a total of 13 people running on the Democratic ballot and 2 people running on the Republican ballot. But as you mentioned, of course, New York City, tends to go blue. So really, a lot of people are eyeing and keeping their eyes on the Democratic ballot today.
So some voters have already cast their ballots during the early voting period. What are they saying are the most important issues for them?
Good question. Yeah, the polls opened up this morning. One of them right here behind me at 6 o'clock this morning. They will remain open until 9 o'clock tonight. The second that the polls opened up, we went right in there. They allowed us to go in there and start talking with some voters, and a lot of people saying crime. Crime really is the #1 issue here in New York City right now for this mayoral race. A lot of New Yorkers, honestly, they're afraid, and they want to make sure that the next mayor makes them feel safer. Crime has skyrocketed, if you will, during this pandemic. The latest polls latest numbers rather show New York City in May was up more than 70% in just shootings, and of course a lot of other crime as well across the city. Then a lot of people also talking about affordable housing during this pandemic. A lot of people lost their jobs and they were not able to afford their rents. Of course, rents did decrease during the pandemic because a lot of people were moving out of New York. However, though, those rents went right back up recently, and people trying to return back to New York, they're hitting that same problem where they can't afford New York City anymore. So they really want to make sure that New York stays affordable. And of course, the third one is the COVID recovery. That pandemic, the pandemic really hit this city really hard. And a lot of people, they want to make sure that if there is another spike in the future, that they will be safe. And they just want to ensure that the next mayor comes in and he or she knows exactly what they're doing with all 3 of those major issues.
That is all fascinating, especially, the issue with crime, because I think back sort of a year ago, and the conversation is still happening about reimagining public safety, but also defunding the police and whatever that means, the protests and the demonstrations in the streets of New York. And now fast forward, and it's, how are you going to handle this crime? So how have the leading candidates' campaign strategies compared, especially in sort of the home stretch? What have they been doing over the last couple of days?
Good question. Yeah, well, Borough President Eric Adams, who's the front runner here, he is a former police officer, so he continues to campaign on that, saying that he knows the police department, he knows the ins and outs, he knows how to properly reform the police department. But Andrew Yang, during one of the debates for this mayoral position, said, we don't know enough about what you want. People say crime's a problem. He says he's a former police officer. He knows what he's talking about. But Andrew Yang saying that he's not giving enough details. And actually over the weekend, Andrew Yang and Catherine Garcia teamed up. They formed this alliance constituents, if you will, to try and get the votes away from Eric Adams, seemingly away from Eric Adams. And Eric Adams was upset about that. He was rather mad about that, saying that that's suppressing the black vote. And now you also have the comptroller, you have Stringer, who was out on Father's Day recruiting his family out there on Sunday, trying to get those last-minute votes. We see Scott Stringer often on the streets, kind of moving towards more of a grassroots campaign, if you will, shaking hands and speaking one-on-one with constituents, whereas the rest of them have been hosting a lot more press conferences and speaking to the media. Scott Stringer really going in and talking a lot more to the people. No doubt, of course, he is also hosting press conferences too, but from what we have been seeing, he's been out there shaking hands and really just wants the vote by vote. He says he will win one vote by one vote.
John, thank you so much for giving us a snapshot of what's happening down there on the streets in New York City with the mayoral race. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. You got it.
Well, you can continue to follow this story on CBSN New York. All you have to do is download the free CBS News app or head on over to cbsnews.com/live. There you can find all of our CBSN local streams.